B. Collins News and Comment. It's Monday, June 29th, 2020. A quick programming note. Your humble host is taking the day off tomorrow. I have to move the sailboat over to get inspected and bring it back, and it's my turn. We will resume on Wednesday as usual. And I woke up this morning to some new surprises from the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Roberts is once again the swing vote, in a vote that swung away from Trump and his appointees to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And this is on the critical issue of abortion rights. And the court has once again struck down a pretextual law brought from a deep pro-birth state, which was an effort to use technicalities to shut down abortion clinics and reduce access, if not eliminate it altogether. And this started with a case from Texas a few years ago that the court struck down when Justice Kennedy was still the pro-choice swing voter. And so there was a lot of uneasy speculation about what Roberts would do. And as he did in the case of trans people and LGBTQ employment rights under the Civil Rights Act, and in the DACA case, John Roberts acted reasonably. And he did not sign on to the majority opinion on the merits. It was written by Justice Breyer, and essentially he said that this phony requirement that an abortion provider also had to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital was simply a way to put an undue burden on a woman's constitutional right to choose to end a pregnancy. He simply said that he has to be consistent and he is respecting precedent. So this leaves us still in an uneasy position because the right-wing red states have just loaded up the pipeline with cases, and I'm trying to remember what state it came from recently. But they wrote a law that ends the right to an abortion at 6 weeks. And in the law, they said, well, and if that gets struck down, 8 weeks, and if that doesn't pass muster, 10 weeks, and if that, right on up to 24 weeks. And so this process will continue. We can expect more challenges. And at some point, Justice Roberts may find that precedent is too burdensome and that he will vote with the right-wingers on the court. The Chief Justice wrote, the Louisiana law imposes a burden on access to abortion just as severe as that imposed by the Texas law. That was a 2014 case. Therefore, Louisiana's law cannot stand under our precedents. Now, I'll take it because I am distressed to see our legislators, the lawmakers, the political leaders basically go silent on abortion rights. It's roughly a 50-50 status in the polls. And so as they operate on a pure reptilian political level, they say for every vote we hold by supporting abortion rights, we lose another one. And that has led to a sharp decline in advocacy for the right to choose. So as of June, that's this month, which is just about over, there were at least 16 abortion cases in federal appeals courts. And so we're going to see this cycle repeat itself. but it did force the hands of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. As you know, during their confirmation hearings, they pretended that they really haven't made up their minds and that, they certainly believe in precedent. And it doesn't matter what we did as lower court judges or what we have advocated publicly over the years. When they're up for confirmation, candidates for the court get really fuzzy all of a sudden. Oh, they also dodge by saying, well, Senator, I can't answer that because this is likely to come before the court. But Gorsuch and Kavanaugh backed the anti-abortion side of this. And so the cat and mouse game is no longer active. Now, just an hour or two after that decision was announced, the court declined to hear a case challenging the resumption of executions by the federal government based on how they would kill the person. As you know, these medical cocktails have been challenged in recent years because they often lead to a protracted and agonizing episode in the death chamber. And what's interesting is only 2 justices indicated that they would have accepted the case, and that's Ginsburg and Sotomayor. And that leads us to believe that Kagan and Breyer will support executions, at least under certain circumstances. And I find it quite not ironic, but just contradictory that a court can uphold the right to choice despite the vociferous so-called right-to-life people. And then it's the right-to-lifers who lead the charge to kill convicted suspects. That is the true state of hypocrisy in America today. Now, the court also acted to undo the intention of Congress when they passed the Dodd-Frank Act and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The language clearly said that the head of that agency could only be fired by the president for cause, defined as inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. And we saw that after Richard Cordray resigned to go lose the race for governor of Ohio, that was in 2017, there was a whole effort to basically ignore the law. And it was challenged actually by business groups who wanted to carve out the authority for the president just to fire this person like any other federal agency. But it was Elizabeth Warren who wrote the law and created the agency, and she was very clear. She wanted the director of this agency to be only fired for just cause. And giving Trump that power enabled him to plug in Mick Mulvaney as the acting director. He has essentially neutralized the agency. And I really don't understand how the court can just bulldoze that law. And also Brett Kavanaugh had written on the lower courts at the D.C. Circuit Appeals Court a 73-page dissent arguing that the CFPB is unconstitutionally structured because it's an independent agency that exercises substantial executive power and is headed by a single director. I'm just an amateur here. I don't have a law degree, but it seems to me that he should have recused himself in that case. While we're watching the court on Friday, the Supremes said that they will not require Texas to let all eligible voters vote by mail. The state Democratic Party and several voters had urged the court to reinstate a federal trial judge's injunction requiring state officials to allow all voters, and not just those 65 plus, to submit their ballots by mail. They relied on the 26th Amendment, which had lowered the voting age to 18, said the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. But Sonia Sotomayor said that it was a weighty but seemingly novel question regarding the 26th Amendment. She said the court was right not to address those questions in the context of an emergency appeal. And then she signaled, I hope, that the Court of Appeals will consider the merits of the legal issues in this case well in advance of the November election. So by not taking action, the state of Texas, which used to be one of those, they were on the shit list for the Voting Rights Act, and they had to get pre-approval for any kind of move like this that they would make that affects people's ability to vote. But the Roberts Court took care of that by eviscerating the Voting Rights Act of 1965's enforcement section a few years ago. And speaking of mail-in voting, Trump is still all worked up. He's tweeting and bleating about this. And he's now making a distinction between an absentee ballot and voting by mail. And he thinks it's okay for him to cast an absentee ballot, even though he doesn't really live in Florida and he's not really allowed to declare Mar-a-Lago his residence, which he's done. But it's the vote by mail, where he imagines that just ballots are passed around like tissue, Kleenex. And whoever decides to mail one in, or a dozen of them, or 100 of them, gets all of those ballots counted. And his ignorance of how voting by mail happens, what kind of restrictions there are these signature checks. And fundamentally, if more ballots come back than there are registered voters, then it's a pretty quick sign that somebody has attempted to game the system. So there's this case that's emerged recently from Paterson, New Jersey. And Trump is claiming that 25% of the ballots there, 19% of the ballots were fraudulent. Well, there were 9,000 ballots cast by mail in a prior year, and this year was 17,000. It was still the lowest turnout election in Paterson, New Jersey since at least 2014. And so at issue is some 3,300 ballots that were thrown out by the County Board of Elections. And this is the other thing that occurs that I'm not so sanguine about when everybody votes by mail. Because when I cast a ballot at the precinct, I at least know that it goes into the hopper. And that I have been checked, at the desk that I'm an eligible voter. But when you put your ballot in the mail, if they decide that it's not going to be accepted, I don't think that you get a notice about that. You just pop it in the mail and kiss it goodbye. At any rate, the 3,300 ballots were rejected because of signatures, for problems with the section filled out by the person who actually submitted the ballot on behalf of somebody else, and then for other various reasons. But this was not a matter of fraud. It's not a matter of a case where they sniffed it out, that somebody tried to game the system by voting multiple times or casting ballots for dead people or things of that sort. So Trump can, blather on about this all he wants, but he continues to tip his hand that he's mostly concerned that too many Democrats will vote by mail, and it will eliminate the voter suppression, the impact of voter suppression schemes by Republicans, which have been largely successful, or at least successful enough to get Republicans elected in places where they didn't have a majority of voters. More court action here on the West Coast at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Despite the way Republicans have packed it with conservatives, a 3-judge panel voted 2-1 that Trump had defied Congress' constitutional authority by redirecting $2.5 billion in military funds to build 130 miles of wall in California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And the justices said, look, Congress appropriated the funds for military pay and other purposes. They never authorized Trump to spend them on wall construction. Funding for the wall had been denied by Congress. The Trump administration lacked independent constitutional authority to steal the money. That's my language. And they don't mention here the phony emergency that was declared as the pretext to divert this money. And as you know, the Supreme Court voted last year 5-4 to allow the work on the wall to continue while cases like this one worked their way up to the court. And by the time they get there, it won't matter because the money will be spent and the wall will at least partly be built. And I want to commend Ben Norton over at the Gray Zone Project. He is exposing that Trump has diverted at least $600 million of money looted from the nation of Venezuela to fund construction of the border wall with Mexico. So what has happened here is that the U.S. has seized at least $1 billion of Venezuelan public money, including the oil company Citgo. They've given some of the money to Juan Guaido, who the U.S. declares is the recognized leader of Venezuela. He runs the supposed interim government. And Ben Norton does a good job of exposing the right-wing coverage of the leading Spanish-language network in this country, Univision, and how the article, which was entitled Legal Battle Over Venezuela's Looted Billions, heats up, buried this diversion of Venezuela's money to pay for Trump's wall that Mexico was going to pay for, right? Such a bizarre world we live in these days. So this story's been buzzing all weekend long. It broke late Friday in the New York Times, was published in the Saturday print edition. Based on anonymous sources in the intelligence community, that Russia has been offering bounties, cash money, to Taliban fighters to kill Americans and other coalition fighters in Afghanistan. Now, let me lead with my skepticism, because in the Washington Post coverage of this story, they say it's resulted in the deaths of, well, it's believed to have resulted in the deaths of several U.S. service members. The New York Times, which originated the story, claims only that at least one American service member has been killed and a bounty was paid. Now, this story has a couple of layers to it. There's a very firm denial from Trump and Trump Co. that the guy who plays president knew anything about this or was briefed on it in March, as the New York Times has alleged. And it is once again Russophobic, and it is based on sources that are not revealed to the public. And when you look at it, number one, the U.S. offers bounties all the time. We had a bounty on Osama bin Laden. I think there's a bounty on Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. And so the idea that this is so underhanded and that Russia is so evil for doing things that the United States routinely does, well, that gets a little rich, doesn't it? So after saying, I am now quoting from the Washington Post, Taliban-linked militants are believed to have resulted with these bounties are believed to have resulted in the deaths of several U.S. service members. Then, in the very next sentence, several people familiar with the matter said it was unclear exactly how many Americans or coalition troops from other countries may have been killed or targeted under the program. Then they reveal that the information came from recently detained opposition fighters, opposition to us, in Afghanistan. And of course, here is the sourcing. These people and others who discussed the matter spoke on the condition of anonymity because of its sensitivity. The intelligence was passed up from U.S. Special Operations Forces based in Afghanistan and led to a restricted high-level White House meeting in late March. So this is being turned into a real controversy, despite the fact that very few Americans have been killed in Afghanistan in recent years. 10 deaths in 2018, 16 in 2019. 2 have been killed so far this year. And Russia, which has been attempting to forge ties with the Taliban for several years now, partly to try to reduce their influence in Syria. If anything, Russia's interest is in getting the United States out of Afghanistan. And the exposure of a bounty plot like this would not advance that interest. So now the Democrats have piled on, once again building on Russiagate and Trump's weird bromance with Putin. Yes, even I think it's really weird. And so our political leaders, actually of both parties, but led by Democrats, are slamming Trump. It started with Biden, who assailed Trump on Saturday for failing to punish Russia for offering bounties to the Taliban to kill American troops, while the White House denied that Trump had been briefed on the months-old classified intelligence assessment. Now, there is a weird game being played here, where Trump doesn't really discuss the central allegation here. He just says, nobody told me. And that then becomes a validation point for the New York Times. It says, well, Trump and his press secretary, they haven't denied the central allegation of this story. So Nancy Pelosi wrote to John Ratcliffe, the latest director of national intelligence, and Gina Haspel, the bloody CIA director. Congress and the country need answers now. Congress needs to know what the intelligence community knows about this significant threat to American troops and our allies, and what options are available to hold Russia accountable. Even knuckle-dragging Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe piled on here. He said, we've known for a long time that Putin is a thug and a murderer, and if these allegations are true, I will work with President Trump on a strong response. My number one priority is the safety of our troops. Right now, we need answers. So now here is the New York Times. Again, they broke the story. Anonymous sources. And they say, American officials believe that the death of at least one U.S. service member was tied to the bounties. So, you know, one or several. We have very few fatalities in Afghanistan over the last 3 years. So at most, this could be related to fewer than 50 lost Americans. And so it's being hyped here as this huge failure by Trump. Oh, and here's the validation part. Kayleigh McEnany, the new White House press secretary, did not challenge the Times reporting on the existence of the intelligence assessment or a National Security Council interagency meeting about it in late March, or the inaction by the White House. So they clearly see something that is kryptonite, and they're basically trying to say, nobody told me there was kryptonite there, and let it go at that. So faster than Who Shot Bob, Scott Ritter has posted his analysis of this situation. It's available at RT, yes, the Russian media outlet. And he says nothing in the New York Times could be corroborated. Indeed, there's no difference between the original reporting conducted by the Times and the confirming reports, that's in quotes, published by the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. All of the reports contain caveats such as if confirmed and if true, while providing no analysis into the potential veracity of the information used to sustain the report, alleged debriefs of Afghan criminals and militants, or the underpinning logic or lack thereof of the information itself. The Russian government has vociferously denied it. He cites John Ratcliffe, Director of National Intelligence, quote, I have confirmed that neither the President nor the Vice President were ever briefed on any intelligence alleged by the Times in its reporting yesterday. And Ritter writes, one more tiny problem, Trump confirmed there was no such briefing too. So the claim by the Times is that it was briefed at the highest levels of the White House and that it was in the presidential daily brief. Now, we know Trump never reads that stuff. So it's up to the briefing intelligence officer to bring it to his attention. And to me, that's a diversion. This report is out, and the Trump administration shouldn't be denying whether the president was briefed on it. They should simply address that this is either accurate or not, and what they have done about it or what they will do about it. So, quoting once again from Scott Ritter, the National Directorate for Security, with or without CIA knowledge or consent, generated detainee-based intelligence reports designed to create and sustain a narrative that would be supportive of U.S. military forces remaining in Afghanistan past 2021. So this is a theory on the part of Scott Ritter. And to me, it makes some sense. And it, number one, underscores a motive for a leaker in the U.S. intelligence community to embarrass Trump about this, because Trump has made it clear that one of the big wins he'd like to present to American voters by November is that he got us out of Afghanistan. So there's a lot that doesn't add up here. It does not compute. But if you watch Rachel Maddow, and I saw her show on Friday, she was just salivating over this. This will become another part of the anti-Trump narrative. And as you know, I take no pleasure in appearing to defend Trump or to attack his attackers. But I'm trapped with this rational thinking. And it gets me into trouble every time. So, as you probably know, the U.S. has issued sanctions on the Iranian Quds Force. They've named individuals in the Iranian government that we have sanctions on. We've basically sanctioned everything we can find related to Iran. Well, now they've turned the tables. Iran has issued an arrest warrant for Donald J. Trump, the real one, and 35 others over the killing of top General Qasem Soleimani back on the 3rd of January. I call it an assassination. And while Americans may recoil and say, what? How can you do that? Well, the illegitimate power play was initiated by the United States when we attempted to declare a wing of the Iranian military as subject to sanctions. They could do that to our Air Force, to the CIA, to the NSA. And at what point do the, what do you want to call them, duly constituted elements of a government's military become so-called terrorists subject to sanction? So Interpol has already announced they won't comply with the Iranian request to execute warrants and arrest Americans. Every day I like to remind people that we're running the Peter B. Collins Community Fund, and at this difficult time, we're handing out $100 grants that have been funded by listeners and a little bit of help from yours truly. I don't have any grant requests today, but I'm willing to receive more. We've got funding. All you have to do is send an email to peter@peterbcollins.com, explain your situation, what you'd use the $100 for, and last week we did our first rejection of a guy who just said he wanted to take his wife out to dinner because he was in the doghouse. That's not a compelling reason to me, but everything else that I've seen has been. Our new correspondent in Seattle, Jonah Leto, files a CHOP report again today. On Saturday night, Mayor Jenny Durkin announced via the press that CHOP barriers, this is the occupied protest on Capitol Hill in Seattle, would be removed on Sunday morning. Nothing happened to the barriers. The press wondered why. By Sunday evening, nothing happened during two marches in different parts of Seattle, one of which ended up at the mayor's home. And Jonah mentions that his father, Paul, has been monitoring media coverage and suggested a hotel room a few blocks from the CHOP, specifically so Jonah could be on the scene overnight. And Jonah says, I got some sleep from 5 p.m. till midnight. My father told me that the public statements of militia organizations threatening a violent retaking of the CHOP on July 4th, together with police statements, meant there would be something happening on Sunday night. And Jonah says when he was about a block away, Monday morning at 2:45 a.m., there were multiple attacks on the CHOP, each coming from outside. I heard at least 3 shots and saw a white Jeep Cherokee burning rubber. People were running both toward and away from where shots were fired. A group of us sheltered on a first-floor apartment. 1 man died as a result of the attack, and 1 boy was hospitalized. Police Chief Carmen Best responded to the attack with an interview at the CHOP. When I was informed that she was having her interviewed around 9:15 in the morning, I walked down the street, found that she had already left. Around the same time, a news media vehicle was stopped by protesters for bumping into one of the protesters. After the vehicle attempted to leave, a man was pushed several feet by the vehicle and was looking to press charges. The perspective inside the CHOP is quite different from media coverage and police statements. Communication between police and protesters has become rare. Police claim that the dead man and the wounded boy were presumably occupants of the abandoned Jeep Cherokee. However, CHOP protesters have countered this claim. In multiple interviews, several have come forward and said how violence and deaths at the CHOP are not performed by occupants, but rather outside agitators. So Jonah says, I asked my father why he wanted to spend money on a hotel room. After all, there hadn't been any violence in almost a week. And Pop said, think of the police and the right-wing militia groups as one entity. By saying they're going to take down barriers and then not doing so is a signal to the outside agitators to take matters into their own hands. The police's central complaint is that they can't do anything because their hands are tied. So they let the vigilantes do it for them. They don't truly investigate. They don't release any names of suspects. Whether or not the police are intentionally signaling, the right-wing groups interpret those statements as signals, and then they take action. CHOP organizers maintain that they feel safe at the CHOP, but they demand what they call police tyranny must stop. In the same informal press conference, a CHOP organizer said, you in the media say you're showing up for Black Lives Matter, but the only time you show up is for black bodies. The CHOP perspective is that there's been a whole lot of ordnance shot at these people by both police and vigilantes, and it's always come from outside, always directed at the CHOP. The central problem with media coverage is the claim that conflicts are caused by the CHOP, rather than stating the truth that the violence is being directed at the protesters. Alan McLeod at Mint Press reports on a peaceful protest in Aurora, Colorado last night that led to some excessive force used by police. There was a vigil for Elijah McClain, a young man who used to play the violin for people, and he died in an encounter with police in Aurora in August of last year. So at 8:30 p.m., a somber violin vigil was held in the city's Center Park. Videos of the event show the police charging the crowd, spraying protesters with pepper spray, and beating them with batons. And the story of Elijah McClain, he was on his way home from buying his brother an iced tea at the convenience store. Some shades of Trayvon. He was accosted by 3 cops who claimed they were on the lookout for a suspicious person. They put McClain in a carotid chokehold, cutting off blood supply to his brain. They said the 5'6", 140-pound McClain, medically diagnosed with anemia, fought back with crazy strength. And they instructed medics to inject him with ketamine, a drug that is often reserved for tranquilizing horses. He was pronounced brain dead after arriving at the hospital. But from officer videos, we have the final words of Elijah McClain. "I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different, that's all. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. But I don't judge people. I don't judge people who do eat meat. Forgive me. All I was trying to do was become better." It took almost a year for huge rallies and a petition signed by 3.8 million people to get the Aurora Police Department to release the videos and address the situation. They put the 3 officers on desk duty. And in other news, in New York, the NYPD broke up an LGBT pride march celebrating the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, part of the annual Pride demonstrations. In Detroit, a police car plowed through a crowd of about a dozen Black Lives Matter activists yesterday, and the scene was caught on camera. In Minneapolis, the city council voted 12-0 to proceed with dismantling their police force. It is the first step in a process that faces significant bureaucratic obstacles to make it to the November ballot. Has to go to the Charter Commission for review. The idea is to replace the department with a Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, which will have responsibility for public safety services, prioritizing a holistic, public health-oriented approach. The amendment goes on to say the director of the new agency would have non-law enforcement experience in community safety services, including but not limited to public health and/or restorative justice approaches. It also provides for a division of licensed peace officers who would answer to the department's director. The news related to law enforcement and incarceration is often pretty dark. And today, I want to cite, and I've linked to this article by Chris Hedges. I've seen it on several sites. I picked it up from Consortium News. In 1990, when Lawrence Bell was 14, orphaned and living in an abandoned house in Camden, New Jersey, cops pressured him to sign a confession of murder. And on Sunday, thanks to the dogged work of an attorney, he was freed. And it's quite a story, because Chris Hedges, as you know, former New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, Turns out that he was a volunteer teacher at the East Jersey State Prison, where this once young man served 30 years and 1 day. He entered at 14 and exits at almost 45. 30 years and 1 day, he said. June 27, 1990, I came into prison at 14 years old. I'm now going on 45. It's amazing, it's scary, but it's here. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. The worldwide statistics have reached a new peak, over 10 million identified cases, and over 500,000 deaths linked to the coronavirus. In the United States, it's 2.5 million cases and nearly 126,000 deaths. At least 26 states reported rises in COVID-19 infections over the last week. New cases up 77% in Arizona, 75% in Michigan, 70% in Texas, 66% in Florida. More than 2.5 million Americans have tested positive from almost 30.1 million tests, and almost 700,000 people are reported to have recovered from the virus. So that leaves a big group of people who've tested positive. Hospitalizations are up, but deaths are not so far. The average age of the confirmed cases is dropping into the range of 30 to 40 as the median. And this is my observation. It's a nice development that fewer people are dying at this point. The rate of deaths nationally has dropped. But this group of people that is testing positive in larger numbers, the younger people, they're carriers, they are spreaders. And they might not wind up hospitalized or risking death. But they can easily be spreading it to other people. And that is the kind of new complex conundrum we face today. And at the CDC, they say, quote, our best estimate right now is that for every case that's been reported, there are actually 10 other infections. And certainly, many people will experience no symptoms and may not ever know that they had it. But they can still spread it at critical points of their own experience with the virus. U.S. Health Secretary Alex Azar has warned that the window is closing on the American chance to take action to effectively curb the virus. He pointed to a recent surge in infections, particularly in the South, said people have to act responsibly by social distancing and wearing face masks. Oh, I hear from a lot of people in my email box every day as people objecting to masks, that this is some form of, coercive performance being inflicted on people. And I recognize that a mask is not a perfect barrier. But if I wear a mask, it reduces the possibility that I could infect you. To me, it is that simple. Now, we're getting conflicting information on the rate of hospitalization and the capacity in Texas. So one Texas hospital says their beds are 100% occupied. That's the Texas Medical Center in Houston. But kind of feeding the skeptics, they removed quietly ICU data from its website because last Thursday they said that their ICU beds were 100% full. Here's a local TV station in Dallas-Fort Worth, NBC5. Documents obtained by the investigative team raise new questions about how many ICU beds remain available in the growing crisis. On Wednesday, only 83% of the hospitals in the North Texas region provided numbers. And that tends to feed the skeptics, and I'll get to them in a moment. This link was sent to me by Mark Crispin Miller from the media outlet called justthenews.com. They feature the work of John Solomon and Cheryl Atkinson, who have their own records. If you know who they are, you can make your evaluation based on that history. But they published a story under the byline of Daniel Payne. Health officials in Texas are logging every single COVID-19 positive hospital patient in the state as a COVID-19 hospitalization, even if the patients are admitted seeking treatment for something other than the coronavirus. So they're basically suggesting here that the figures are being inflated. Now, I don't know how many people go to the hospital for a broken arm, a heart attack, or, ingrown toenail, and get a COVID test and then decide they should go into the hospital. So I find some of the skepticism to be lacking in rational argument. That's the best I can say. The Department of Health and Human Services has ordered 500,000 doses of remdesivir, the first drug shown to be effective at treating hospitalized coronavirus patients. And this comes from Gilead, a longtime profiteer in the pharmaceutical zone. And they've announced that it will take about 6 vials for the average patient. They're going to charge governments just under $400 per vial. Private insurance will pay $520, or about $3,120 for a typical pharmaceutical course. And what gets really strange here is that Daniel O'Day, the CEO of Gilead, wrote an open letter to the public. And get this, they said, in normal circumstances, we would price a medicine according to the value it provides. So, for example, earlier hospital discharge, after the use of remdesivir, which averages a 4-day reduction in hospital stays, would save a hospital about $12,000 per patient. So they price it on a value proposition because you can extract more profit that way. Well, what about the cost? Well, we can't really get into their figures, but an estimate coming from Public Citizen is that the cost is far less than the value pricing that they are trying to impose. Strange ways that these profiteers, that's the best word I can come up with, the way they think. 40% of Americans now believe the worst of COVID-19 is over, behind us, and that's up from 26% in April. The survey was taken June 16 to 22nd, has only a 2% margin of error. 65% of Republicans are comfortable eating in a restaurant now, compared to 28% of Democrats. And I want to thank Linda Lewis because she went in depth on an issue that John Oliver covered on his HBO show last night. And that is that the forbearance to renters and to mortgage payers is winding down. In some states, it's already behind us. You can be, or at least eviction processes can be started now. And in others, it's coming up sometime in the month of July. If your home is covered by the Federal CARES Act, you have at least until July 25th before the threat of eviction grows some teeth. For many others, the time has already come. So Linda is recommending a link from cnet.com, which has a whole range of frequently asked questions and discussions of how you can deal with a rent freeze and whether you owe money or late fees as a result, when they can begin eviction proceedings. And so I'll put the link in the show file for today's podcast and invite you to take a look. Here's one other tip. The CARES Act temporarily bans evictions and late fees until July 25th. It requires 30-day notice to vacate before you can be evicted. So the soonest your landlord can ask you to leave is July 25th. The problem is that not every home, not every apartment is covered under the federal regulations. So here's another nonprofit you could consult, justshelter.org. They put tenants facing eviction in touch with local organizations that can help you. The legal services website, nolo.com, has a list of which states have and have not passed emergency bans on evictions. So it varies widely by where you live and what the rules are. And again, if $100 would help you get past July 1st, don't be shy. Send an email to Peter at peterbcollins.com. And finally, Linda notes that if you have been to one of the public protests in recent weeks, it's a good idea to get tested for the coronavirus. Experts disagree on how long to wait post-exposure before you get tested. Some say at least 3 or 4 days, others say at least a week. The longer you wait, the greater the chance the test will detect any virus. And of course, it is just a snapshot at that point. And you could be exposed after you have a positive test. So it's not like, it's a get out of jail free card, or, that it means you are guaranteed to be free of the virus forever. Here in California, because of the rising numbers, in 7 counties, Governor Newsom has ordered that bars be closed. That is Fresno, Imperial, Kern, Kings, Los Angeles, San Joaquin, and Tulare. And he is working to, once again, impose a lockdown in Imperial County, where things have really spun out of control. The health system is completely overwhelmed. More than 300 people have been airlifted or taken out by ambulance to other areas for treatment. And that is the most southern, most eastern county of California. It borders Mexico and Arizona. And as we've known, we have further confirmation. 43% of virus-related deaths in the United States are of residents and employees at nursing homes. The number is now over 54,000. In a weekend interview at CNN, Dr. Anthony Fauci said the U.S. is unlikely to achieve herd immunity, even with a vaccine. He warns that a general anti-science, anti-authority, anti-vaccine feeling is likely to thwart vaccination efforts. And he also says that the vaccine may not work, particularly on older people. And, Fauci is in his position, and he is part of the medical establishment. But when you look at critics of vaccine, they're not just all reflexively opposed to every vaccine, but people who have studied vaccine safety have shown us that not every vaccine works. The side effects of some are extreme. The risks are borne by the public, not by the vaccine manufacturers or developers. And in the rush to get a vaccine out there, I think a lot of bad stuff can happen. So Fauci was asked if herd immunity could be achieved if 2/3 of the population took the vaccine and that it was at least 70 to 75% effective. And he said, no, that's unlikely. And that's when he kind of vented on the people who are skeptical about vaccines. But he doesn't acknowledge the history and that a lot of rational people have good reason to be skeptical of those vaccines. Li Feng, reporting at The Intercept today, notes that back in February and March, as the U.S. was getting serious about the pandemic, there was the huge scramble for PPE. We all know what that means now, masks and gowns and gloves. And at the very same time, the U.S. was exporting hundreds of tons of medical face masks to China. The masks were shipped abroad. Most of them were sent by air cargo. And detailed disclosures of these airlifts are hidden from public view by the federal government. U.S. Customs and Border Protection only allows public disclosure of detailed cargo data for shipments sent and received by sea, not by air. And so by using aircraft, they were able to get them there faster and to avoid disclosures. And of course, we know how the alarms were going off. This guy, Rick Bright, the whistleblower who got bounced by the Trump administration, he was scrambling back in February to try to line up PPE and did not know that over 600 tons of face masks left U.S. airports for China in February alone. That is stunning. Finally, today, a couple of stories from Israel. We are approaching July 1st, that's Wednesday, and sometime shortly thereafter, Netanyahu seems poised to try to announce a widespread annexation of land in the West Bank. Now, his so-called alternate prime minister, Benny Gantz, who is supposed to succeed Netanyahu in about 17 months, has suggested that annexation will have to wait while the country deals with its coronavirus crisis. Now, I'll take any excuse to delay or terminate the plan for the annexation, but that one seems a little bit thin. Benny Gantz told a White House envoy, Avi Berkowitz, that the July 1st deadline was neither sacred nor urgent. Netanyahu said that it's not up to Gantz to make that decision. Discreet contacts with the U.S. were continuing. And the top human rights official from the United Nations, Michelle Bachelet, said annexation is illegal, period. I am deeply concerned that even the most minimalist form of annexation would lead to increased violence and loss of life, as walls are erected, security forces deployed, and two populations brought into closer proximity. And finally today, a Jerusalem court early on Sunday ordered the release of former Air Force general and leading activist opponent of Netanyahu, retired Brigadier General Amir Haskell. He's been a leader of the protest movement. He and several others were picked up on Friday in what police said was an illegal demonstration because the protesters blocked a road. Haskell said, "No one will prevent us from protesting anywhere." The arrest drew angry denunciations from prominent Israelis. Hundreds protested outside Netanyahu's residence, some holding signs urging their crime minister to resign immediately. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with everyone. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.